As most of the world watches the devastation happening in Ukraine, not many people are asking the question, are Ukrainians really so different from Russians? Today, you'll find out the answer and the results might surprise you. As you can see in the title, we're talking about the average person, so some amount of generalization will have to happen in this video. That said, we still have a truckload of differences for you. Before we get into the cultural stuff, living standards, and what's going on in the minds of the people, you're going to need to hear some hard facts. About 146 million people live in Russia, and about 43 million live in Ukraine. Both countries are ethnically diverse, with an estimated 130 ethnicities living in Ukraine and 193 ethnicities living in Russia. Most people think that ethnic Russians and Ukrainians have a kind of European look, if not Slavic European, but let's remember, Russia is also part of Asia. Ukraine is quite big too, the second largest country in Europe after Russia. So if you go over to those two nations, especially to the hinterlands of Russia, you're gonna see that many folks have very Asian looks, far from the average ethnic European look. Russia is so damn big and stretches past so many Asian nations that a lot of Russians don't look or live like Vladimir Putin or Peter the Great. Russia is much more diverse than Ukraine, simply because of its size. Peter the Great had dark hair and dark brown eyes, which is why he's said to have had Tartar looks, a Turkic ethnic group that we can trace back to the Mongolian plateau. Putin looks nothing like Peter the Great, with his blonde hair and blue-green eyes, so we guess he has Northern European or Eastern European ethnic background. More Russians have blonde hair than Ukrainians do, especially in northern and western Russia. But as we said, Russians can also look Asian. Nonetheless, about 75% of Russians live in the European part of the country. 17.3% of Ukrainians identify as Russian ethnicity, and 78% identify as Ukrainian ethnicity. That leaves a bunch of others in Ukraine, such as people who identify as Belarusian, Moldovan, Crimean Tatar, and Bulgarian. Whereas in Russia, you find the indigenous folks of Siberia, the Mongolian people, and the Sakhalin Koreans, who, again, look nothing like the Russian people you generally see in European Europe, because the island they come from is close to Japan. Even with all this diversity around, we can find averages. In Russia, the average height for men is 176.65 centimeters, and for women, it's 164.5 centimeters. That's pretty damn tall, but Ukraine tops it at an average height of 180.98 centimeters for men and 162.62 centimeters for women. It's likely that the Asians, who tend to be shorter than Europeans, bring down the height average for Russians. Both countries are filled with mostly Slavic people, and the Slavs are generally tall on average. What about how long these people are going to live on average? This one tells us some disturbing truths about both nations. In Ukraine, the life expectancy for men is 66.7 years, and for women, it's 76.2 years, making the average for everyone closer to 72 years. This is low in terms of EU countries, where the life expectancy for men and women on average for the whole of the EU is 77.8 and 83.3 respectively. But in Russia, things are worse. If you're a man, you can expect on average to live to 66.4. If you're a woman, you can expect to reach 76.4, with the overall average for Russian people being 71.5, almost the same as Ukraine. You might be wondering why men in both countries live on average such profoundly shorter lives than women. It's a 10-year difference, but in many countries around the world, women on average live just 3, 4, maybe 5 years more. Actually, the US had quite a big gap at almost 6 years, but life expectancy in the US is kind of different from most very developed nations, not in a good way. Still, that's not as bad as Russia and Ukraine. The reason Ukrainian and Russian men fare so much worse is said to be partly a consequence of heavy drinking and heavy smoking. Yep, a straight shot of vodka for breakfast isn't good for the old liver. And that morning vodka shot is based on the truth. Scientific studies said so. One of them stated that a Russian guy has a 25% chance of dying before he's 55, and it said vodka could take a lot of the blame. You can look at other studies that say the same thing, but why not just go to Russia? And then you'll see the population of people over 65 is way more female. But it's a similar scene in Ukraine, where officials are saying booze, as well as a generally crappy lifestyle, is killing Ukrainian men at an age when they should be buying a midlife crisis motorbike. Both the nations have a high per capita alcohol consumption rate. But the problem is hard liver-busting liquor is often the drink of choice, and way more guys imbibe heavily than women. These are traditional nations in which men have historically been the heavy drinkers. So we can make a close comparison between the two countries here, but Russia is worse when it comes to extreme boozing. The sad fact is that in both nations there are more male babies born and more male youngsters, but as people pass the age of 25, the males die off like dinosaurs, and at an old age there is around double the number of women than men in both countries. Let's all now say a prayer for the lonely babushkas of the world who don't have a man to hug at night. Excessive vodka drinking is not good. But who could blame the fellas for wanting a quick fix with their buddies if most of the days of their lives are full of hard, stressful work for very little money? We all know that poverty breeds all kinds of problems, physical and mental. This brings us to money matters. It's a sad fact that many people in Russia and Ukraine live very hard lives just because wages sometimes don't sustain their well-being. Again, the two countries share a lot of similarities in this regard. The minimum wage in Russia in 2023 was reported to be $228 a month, while the average wage was $877 a month. This is not much when you consider a McDonald's combo meal will set you back $5.69, and a one-bedroom apartment in Moscow or a three-bedroom house in the suburbs of Moscow will cost you around $1,000 a month, 5 times the minimum wage. Even professionals struggle. One person wrote on a forum, "My friend lives in Moscow and she's a lawyer. She can't even pay the rent because it's her full monthly salary. Someone pass her the vodka." How do the low-wage earners in Moscow, the people that clean the floors and serve the burgers, survive? The poor have been priced out of life in many European countries, but it is really bad in Ukraine and Russia, where at least vodka is really cheap. Wages are worse in Ukraine. The poor are suffering, especially now as their country is being bombarded with missiles. The minimum wage in Ukraine is just less than $150 a month, and the average wage is $398 a month. A McDonald's combo will set you back just over $4. In Kyiv, a one-bedroom apartment in the city will cost someone around $480, and a three-bedroom place outside of the city will cost about $500. So again, people are priced out of life, or at least they are in the cities. This is happening in places such as London in the UK. But even though social welfare systems in Russia and Ukraine have been somewhat modernized of late, they're not as good as in many European nations such as Britain. Then again, the GDP per capita in the UK is about $46,000, in Ukraine it's less than $5,000, in Russia it's about $14,000. If you look at something called the Gini coefficient, which measures wealth gaps in nations, of those 3 nations we've mentioned, Ukraine is actually doing very well, ensuring the wealth gap isn't too big overall. While the UK is way worse and Russia is the worst of the 3. Ukraine is bad where car ownership is concerned, which is sometimes how we figure out how well people in a country are faring economically. Ukraine's ownership rate is one of the worst in Europe, at 232 cars per 1,000 people, with 601 per 1,000 being the European average. Russia is also below average at 397 cars per 1,000. And it's not as if these countries are small. A Ukrainian man named Alex Podinyet said on a forum that mass transit is underdeveloped in his country, but cars are too expensive for most people and are still seen as a luxury. In Western Russia, cars are less of a luxury. Not having a car would really suck in some more rural parts of these countries, although Russia in general has a better standard of public transport. It's a richer country, of course, so it can afford to build better transport systems. The IMF said Russia's nominal GDP in 2022 was $2.2 trillion compared to Ukraine's $199.7 billion, a huge difference. This may affect how many people get hitched, and indeed, more folks get married in Russia on average. In 2021, the rate was 5.8 per 100,000 in Ukraine and 6.3 per 100,000 in Russia. The divorce rate in Russia for that year was 4.4 per 100,000 and Ukraine was 3.2. So now let's focus on the big reason why there are so many money issues in both nations. There's a whole lot of poverty in Ukraine, but wealth is far more spread out than in Russia. After all, at the end of the Soviet Union, the oligarchs looted all the money from Russia. Putin might be a mad autocrat with delusions of grandeur for Russia, but he did at least bring some stability to a nation that was a walking disaster. That's why, despite his aggression in Ukraine, he's still pretty hot in the popularity ratings. Russia is still corrupt as hell today, but then Ukraine has been plagued by corruption for a long time too. Even President Volodymyr Zelensky, who has said he will clean things up in terms of corruption, was not long ago found to be hiding some of his wealth in offshore accounts. As for Putin, there are unverified claims he's worth $200 billion. Whatever the case, nepotism is a big problem in both countries. Both these nations' populaces are sick of corruption because there's just too much of it. You can see that in the data. According to Transparency International and its corruption index, Russia lies in 136th place for levels of corruption, with 1 being the best. Ukraine was at 122nd place, and so only slightly better than Russia. The people of both nations are only too aware of the official skullduggery, but right now, Ukrainian independent media, not Russian media, is doing a commendable job of exposing corruption. Russia lies in 155th place on the Press Freedom Index, compared to Ukraine's far healthier 96th place. Ukrainians obviously have much more freedom to speak their minds, and as you'll see soon, they often do. We'll show you how the war in Ukraine might actually be improving society in some ways. Maybe people believe that when their hard lives are over, they'll go to heaven. The question is, which heaven, dictated by what book? Both Ukrainians and Russians have vast numbers of people who will tell you they're Orthodox Christians, but when you consider that only about 1 to 2% of Russians actually go to church just once a year, that tells you a lot. After all, this country was formerly ruled by scientific materialist communists. Stalin had millions of Christians killed. It's hardly surprising that Russians in general are not the kind of people to talk about their devotion to God Almighty. They are realists, maybe to a fault, something we'll also talk more about soon. Around 6.5% of Russians are Muslims, and there's a very small sprinkling of Buddhists, Jews, and Hindus. Around 13% of Russians will tell you they're atheists. Around 67% of Ukrainians are Orthodox Christians belonging to various kinds of Christian orthodoxy. It depends where in Ukraine you live as to how pious you are, but in general, Ukrainians are more religious. Some reports say of the Ukrainian Orthodox Christians, around 15% go to church at least once a week. Only about 4% of Ukrainians will tell you they're atheists. The location of these two nations means a lot in terms of traditions and mindsets. You already know that Russia's diversity comes from its hugeness and its proximity to Asian nations. But you also ought to know that Ukraine over the years might have been greatly influenced by Lithuanian, Polish, and Turkish cultures. Meanwhile, Russians might have taken more from Finnish and Hungarian cultures. It's a complex issue since we're talking about massive nations over centuries of immigration, but there are small things that show you the differences. We're sure if you visited both of these countries, you'll say about the food, it seemed pretty similar to me. Yes, there are lots of similarities, but in general, Ukrainian food is more influenced by Mediterranean cuisine and Russian food by Northern European cuisines. We're talking about populated areas here, not tribal areas where the people still do a lot of hunting and gathering. Ukrainians usually put more spices in their food and eat more meat and dairy. Russians eat a lot more fish and grains in general, and the food is often not as spicy. Russians are also very partial to a pickle or two, more so than Ukrainians. In both countries, you'll find each other's traditional fare, such as Ukrainian borscht or beet soup, and Russia pelmeni, dumpling stuffed with meat. These things have crossed the borders, as have many traditions. Linguistically, Russian and Ukrainian are Slavic languages. If you speak one and not the other, you'll still get the gist of what the other person is saying. Even so, just about anyone you talk to in Ukraine will also speak Russian very well. Ukrainian is the official language, but Russian speakers are everywhere, and in the East, that's often their chosen first language. The Ukrainian language has Polish and Czech influences, and a lot of what you might hear come from Turkic words. Russian has French, Turkic, and German influences. There are differences in pronunciations and grammar, but despite all these things, people who speak only one of these languages will be able to understand a lot of what the other is saying. Russian and Ukrainian are not chalk and cheese, they're more like yogurt and cream. Now, let's get controversial. If we're talking about mindsets, we're entering a minefield where at any step we might offend someone. People are so different, and given the size of the countries we're talking about, saying that they are a lot like this or like that is a bit silly. Still, there can be some truth to generalizations. You just shouldn't rely on them to understand the world. Both Russia and Ukraine are often called traditional cultures, in that men are often supposed to act like men. Old school macho men, breadwinning men, men that never cry or ask for help, or so sometimes end up at the end of a bottle of vodka. Meanwhile, women, their wives, are generally supposed to take care of the children in the house. We repeat, this is in general. The stereotypical Russian guy in a Hollywood movie is often tough and shows no emotions whatsoever. That stereotype seems to suggest these people are stoic and able to put up with what they consider a hard and dark existence. Still, there is poetic beauty to that darkness, as the great Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky might have said. It seems true that Russians tend to not smile unless they really mean it, unlike in the US, where smiling even when you're not happy is quite normal. It doesn't mean they're always unhappy in Russia, but it just might mean they're reserved. A Russian man said on a forum he thinks that some Russian men tell sexist jokes in which it's understood that acting emotionally is such a womanly thing to do. So again, traditional gender norms come into play. We found websites that said Ukrainians are all just the same in the smiling department. In this country, gender stereotypes are also very common. But generally, Ukrainians also might seem quite somber if you don't know them. A Ukrainian psychologist explained why people could sometimes look quite down. He said, "Many Ukrainians are not sure of their future. They're unable to find a decent job, feel stressed out whenever they visit obnoxious civil servants, and cannot get proper medical service, free or paid." Fair enough. But another writer we found said it is Russians who carry around all the darkness, not Ukrainians. The same writer said Ukrainians are more individualistic. She also said Russians look to authorities to tell them what to do and will put up with autocratic leaders, while Ukrainians are more likely to rebel. They're not as oppressed, she said, so they might smile more. A Ukrainian man writing about this topic said Russians, however weary they feel, look for strong leaders in charge, while Ukrainians are more about individuality. We looked at a large survey that asked people of both countries questions, and it seems Russians generally put a lot of trust in the state, and Ukrainians showed very low institutional trust. The survey suggested that Russians will tolerate a lot more from the state, even if they're more persecuted than Ukrainians. Ukrainians in general were more open to change in light of liberalism and gave answers that seemed less insular. Their outlook seemed more democratic and European, which is hardly surprising, but there was still a high level of distrust in the government, officialdom, and especially the police. The report makes Ukraine sound really progressive, open, and tolerant, while Russia comes off like an oppressive state with oppressed people. Nonetheless, gender-based violence is widespread in Ukraine, as is torture by police, horrendous attacks against LGBTI people, and racist, sometimes neo-Nazi attacks against ethnic minorities, which have ended in death, such as the killing of a Roma guy by ultra-nationalists. There have been plenty more racist attacks that ended in deaths, and the color of the skin was the reason for the violence, nothing else. Just recently, when the war started in 2022, Africans trying to escape Ukraine said they'd been treated horribly. A Nigerian woman got on a train with her baby and was told to leave. She asked why and was informed, "If you're black, you should walk." Another person said, "We felt treated like animals." Many Africans said they were attacked while trying to get out and were just left stranded, with no help forthcoming. Some suffered maltreatment at the hands of officials. Is there racism in Ukraine? You're damn right there is, but that doesn't mean the average person is like that. Far from it. But the average dude or dudess might experience it. Russia is similarly renowned for its racism, but perhaps things are changing there too. We found a Black American blogger who traveled all over Russia recently, and she said she felt no racism and saw no racism everywhere she went. The United Nations said Russia's immigrant population is the world's third largest, and reports state that after a massive influx of immigrants in the 2000s, hate crimes have decreased by a lot. Russia has plenty of well-known human rights abuses, but let's not pretend Ukraine is a beacon of liberalism. Both countries have a lot of work to do in this regard. Racist attacks and violence against foreigners are actually worryingly common in Ukraine, and journalists and human rights defenders have been killed after talking about controversial issues. In Russia, such violence might not actually be as bad as in Ukraine on average, but it still seems rather closed off to significant human rights reform. Autocratic countries usually are. This is why Ukraine might be changing a lot faster than Russia. With the world watching Ukraine and with all the support, it knows it needs to improve in these areas. Both nations are still somewhat living in the dark ages where sex, sexuality, and race are concerned. But Ukraine could improve faster now that it's hooked up with the liberal West. Maybe that's too optimistic, given the hate crime-related attacks happening in the US and, to a lesser extent, Western Europe frequently, but we do think this war will change things in Ukraine relating to intolerance. If you look at the Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights statistics in the last few years relating to reported racist and anti-LGBTI attacks, there were more attacks in Russia, but given the population, more attacks in Ukraine per capita. Anti-Semitism was much more common in Ukraine, and anti-LGBTI attacks were more common in Russia. A Ukrainian rights activist called the war a litmus test of civilization, saying the spotlight being on Ukraine had improved things somewhat for LGBTQI folks. Maybe after the war, things will improve more, and perhaps also encourage Russia to improve too. Okay, now who's wearing the rose-tinted specs? Moving on, in 2014, a writer for The Washington Post wrote, "Russia versus Ukraine, a clash of brothers, not cultures." It's hard to find anything so positive nowadays. Fast forward to 2022, and another news outlet wrote, "Why Russia and Ukraine are not and have never been fraternal peoples." But at the end of the day, nature plays a bigger part in shaping who we are than nurture. All humans strive for well-being, for love, for friendship, for security and agency. Their attitudes might be partly shaped and sometimes airbrushed by politics and culture, but none of us, not Ukrainians or Russians, Americans or North Koreans, right or left, are very different intrinsically. We sometimes just think we are. Now you need to watch 50 insane facts about Russia you didn't know, or let some horror into your life in Russian Sleep Experiment Explained.